Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
Julia Guerrero stood in the middle of the kitchen at a wide marble countertop, cheerfully chopping salad. The young woman was getting ready to celebrate her third wedding anniversary with her husband Ignacio, and she wanted to prepare something special for him that evening. After searching through her culinary book, she decided on a delicate mushroom risotto and fish baked in a special creamy sauce that she had recently come up with. In the refrigerator, a bottle of excellent white wine had been specially prepared for this festive day. At the moment when Julia was about to cut the tomatoes into a fancy shape, her head suddenly started spinning violently. Instinctively dropping the sharp knife, Julia tightly grabbed onto the countertop and closed her eyes tightly. Even with her eyes closed, the world around her continued to spin, like a carousel in an amusement park where someone forgot to turn off the speed control. Struggling to reach the chair, Julia sat down and began to take deep breaths, counting to 3. 1, 2, 3. She tried to calm her rapid breathing. Her heart, like a trapped bird, was fluttering and seemed to threaten to jump out. What on earth is happening? Julia couldn't stop complaining, patiently waiting for the hated dizziness to subside. This wasn't the first attack she had experienced recently. With alarming frequency, weakness and sudden dizziness had been repeating themselves, making Julia seriously think about her health. She was only 25 years old. However, in the last couple of months, she had felt like she was 70. Sometimes it got so bad that she couldn't even lift her head off the pillow. Her blood pressure skyrocketed to the point where she had to call an ambulance a couple of times. However, the doctors just shrugged their shoulders. None of them could determine the cause of her frequent discomfort. The doctors prescribed endless tests, and every time they said the same thing. By all the major indicators, Julia was perfectly healthy. And the attacks and sudden spike in blood pressure were likely the result of weather sensitivity or some magnetic storm. In short, Julia's condition remained a real mystery to her. The situation was further complicated by her husband's strange reaction. Instead of supporting his sick wife, Ignacio only grumbled, "Julia, you really know how to spoil the mood. You have children, now this illness. I don't know why I need a wife like this." "Ignacio, why do you talk like that?" asked his wife in confusion. "We've been together for 3 years now, and before that, I hardly ever got sick. Do you think I enjoy feeling this way? And as for the fact that we don't have children yet, maybe it's just not the right time. You heard what the doctors said. I am healthy. We just need to wait for pregnancy. It's because there's always something wrong with you." Ignacio replied accusingly. "You're always lacking attention or feeling bad. I'm tired of it. I need a normal wife, strong and healthy. Cheerful. But with you, I feel like I'm living with a toad, cold and boring, and always sick." Julia swallowed her insult, not understanding why her husband was suddenly so angry with her. Lately, she felt like he was only with her out of obligation, as if someone was forcing him to be there. Although they didn't lack anything, they lived in a beautiful, large house and had plenty of money. Ignacio's parents were very wealthy businessmen, and their fortune was counted in the tens of millions. Perhaps that's why Ignacio was so spoiled. He had grown up getting everything he wanted and would get angry when things didn't go his way. These negative habits carried over into his marriage with Julia. Everything in the house revolved around Ignacio's wishes, and Julia didn't have much right to speak in anything. At most, she was allowed to choose the bedding and curtains for the living room. Ignacio and his mother Rosana were in charge of everything else. Rosana was a smart and powerful woman who often visited them. Strangely enough, she was much kinder and gentler with Julia than her neglectful husband. She would give Julia valuable advice on how to cook a certain dish so that her precious son would like it. And she would always give Julia valuable instructions on how a wife should look for such a wealthy and respected person as Ignacio. "Julia, my dear, can you tell me, please, when was the last time you visited a beauty salon?" The mother-in-law asked casually. "Don't get me wrong, I'm not criticizing you, I just think it's time for a new haircut and maybe a more interesting hairstyling." In response, Julia just timidly pressed her lips together. "I just haven't had the time, Rosanna," she hurriedly replied. "I'm tired from cooking, cleaning, and knitting a sweater for Ignacio. He said there are terrible drafts in his office building during the winter, and it's easy to catch a cold. It's strange that such a modern building has drafts." Julia realized how silly her words sounded, given that Ignacio was the director of a well-known design agency in the city's largest business center. The office surely had good insulation and high-quality, draft-proof windows. But her husband still complained about drafts in the evening. Oh, Julia suddenly realized. So that's what he meant by wanting that sweater from the latest collection. The cashmere one. Right, Rosanna? Instead of answering, the mother-in-law just smiled condescendingly and slightly closed her eyes. She enjoyed watching how Julia slowly learned the rules of her world, the world of wealthy people who could buy anything they wanted. "Don't worry, my dear," she reassured the future bride, patting her hand. "Soon, you'll learn everything and be able to anticipate my son's every desire with just a flutter of his lashes. And about the salon, you should still consider it. Nothing makes a woman look more beautiful than good skin and well-styled hair. After all, you and Ignacio need to go out in public occasionally. You never know what people might think of you. You need to look the part." Julia remained silent and didn't tell Rosanna that her son had long preferred to attend all social events alone, leaving his wife at home each time, as if she weren't even his wife. Or perhaps he was embarrassed by her in front of his colleagues. Julia had never been to her husband's workplace either. A couple of times when she wanted to bring her husband a hot homemade lunch, he had just refused, citing his busy schedule, and promised her that he would eat at the local restaurant, where, in his opinion, there was quite good Japanese food. "Okay." Julia nodded to the tall, slender woman in the expensive tweed suit. "I think I'll make an appointment with my hairstylist tomorrow." "Good." Rosanna clicked her tongue approvingly. "You should never forget about your beauty. You need to take care of your appearance. Do you know how many different beauties he has at work?" Rosanna headed towards the door, thanking Julia for the tea, but suddenly stopped. Looking around as if she had remembered something, she spoke sweetly, turning to her son's wife. "And another thing, Julia," she said in a tone of another admonition. "If I were you, I would still hire a servant. It's not fitting for the Guerrero family to clean the floors and dust the tables themselves." Julia replied calmly. "Thank you, Rosanna, but I don't agree with you on that. I don't need strangers in my home. And I can do cleaning just as well as hired workers. Why waste money unnecessarily?" A look of displeasure briefly flashed across Rosanna's face, as if she were talking not to Julia, but to some obstinate saleswoman from a clothing store. "Well, suit yourself," she grudgingly said. "Just please, for heaven's sake, don't tidy up when Ignacio is home. He really doesn't like it. When my son was little, he was annoyed by cleaning and those who regularly did it in our house." Rosanna intentionally avoided using the offensive word servant towards Julia. However, she made it clear through her demeanor that she did not want to see her young daughter-in-law in such a contemptible role. Julia tried, truly tried, to become the kind of woman who would please both her stylish husband and noble mother-in-law, who always assured the girl that she wished nothing but the best for her and her son. However, overall, nothing changed, and her relationship with her husband became increasingly strained. Moreover, the initiative clearly came from Ignacio. The man found the slightest reason to reprimand his young wife. And the further they went, the more absurd his demands became. "Why are you holding your fork in your left hand, Julia?" he once asked her in a restaurant when they decided to go out for a celebratory dinner to mark Ignacio's latest, particularly advantageous deal for his agency. His wife responded with only a puzzled shrug. "I don't know, I guess I've been used to it since childhood. It's more comfortable for me to eat with my left hand." "But not for me," her husband unexpectedly snapped. "Why do you do everything differently? It infuriates me. Can't you eat with your right hand? Julia nervously looked around. Ignacio spoke loudly, and the girl was afraid that other people would start looking at them askance. Another scandal was clearly not what she needed. Quiet, dear, calm down, her spouse's wife tried to reason with him. What does it matter how I eat if no one's watching us anyway? At least they weren't until you started publicly questioning me about it. Ignacio changed instantly. His skin turned red. Instead of calmly continuing their dinner or at least responding to Julia, he noisily threw the towel that had been on his lap onto the table and, rising from his seat, loudly exclaimed in a way that would surely be heard by all the restaurant's guests, "Thank you, dear wife. I'm full. Full to the brim with your ignorance and truly plebeian manners. If you like, you can continue to enjoy your dinner alone because I won't tolerate such an ill-mannered person beside me. Thank you, Julia, my mood today has been completely ruined, and all thanks to you." With these words, Ignacio, ignoring his wife's pleas to stay, headed towards the restaurant exit. Of course, Julia had no choice but to follow him. She was like a naughty dog who had misbehaved in the yard in front of everyone and was now being led away by the ear. Sometimes Julia was amazed at where a young 30-year-old man could be such a snob. Was it worth mentioning that her husband behaved completely differently at the beginning of their relationship? Nothing could prepare the girl for how her spouse would turn out after putting an engagement ring on Julia's finger. Only gradually did his true essence begin to manifest in him. And the girl had to admit that life with a rich and promising man is not always roses, honey, and romantic flights on a private jet to other countries. In such a life, there is also shame, moral discomfort, and a constant desire to understand what exactly you did wrong to your significant other. Anyway, Julia wanted to make peace with her husband, so she discovered the coveted anniversary date in the calendar and decided to prepare a romantic dinner for herself and Ignacio to try to smooth out some of the rough edges in their relationship. The girl hoped that she could still ignite some spark of interest in herself and her spouse, so she exerted all her efforts to make the evening truly perfect. Waiting for the sudden weakness and sickness to pass, Julia continued to prepare the salad. To avoid feeling so lonely, since her husband was always at work at this time, the girl turned on a mini radio. It stood right here, on one of the hanging shelves. Julia loved listening to music while cooking. So now, pressing the liquid crystal display a few times and finding her favorite radio station, she made the sound louder and started humming familiar popular tunes. And she didn't forget to check on her main dish in the oven. Having prepared a special cheese plate for wine, consisting of several varieties of premium cheese, the girl wanted to throw away the packaging from the products in the trash can. Opening a small drawer under the sink, Julia bent down to hit the trash can accurately. Her surprise was immense when, at the bottom of the nearly empty plastic bucket, the girl saw the packaging of some medicinal product. Taking the red and white cardboard box in her hands, Julia turned it over but could not recall her or Ignacio ever buying anything similar for their family. Medicamento was completely unfamiliar to her, and the strange name only added to the mystery. Then, deciding to postpone dinner preparation for a moment, and making sure that the fish was almost ready and just needed to rest, Julia turned off the oven. She went to her room and opened the small and elegant laptop that her husband had given her on their first anniversary together. With a heart beating with excitement, Juliet entered the name of medicine into the search engine. For a moment, the light blue browser wheel spun thoughtfully, and then it gave her several pages with different websites where the medicamento that the girl had found was presented. Clicking on the one that seemed most reliable, Juliet immediately started to study the contents of the webpage. "Now let's see what I found," mused the girl, scrutinizing the composition of the medicine. After a few minutes, it became clear to her that it was one of the medicine in the group of mild neuroleptics, and a highly dangerous one if taken for too long. After reading about the side effects and problems with overdosing, Julia felt an unabated horror. In both cases, there was complete intoxication of the body and a high probability of a heart attack, up to a lethal outcome. But how could such a dangerous medicine have ended up in their garbage bucket at home, which clearly could not be bought so easily? Looking at the price, the girl quietly whistled. Even if it was an antidepressant, it was definitely from some elite group of medicine. Julia felt panic slowly but surely overtaking her. The same questions kept swirling in her pretty, dark-haired head. What was such a medicine doing in their garbage bucket, and who on earth needed to buy it? As far as she remembered, if Ignacio had problems with irritability and unjustified outbursts of aggression, he did not treat them in any way, considering his behavior perfectly normal. As for Rosanna, of course, she suffered from some heart problems, but she would certainly not have taken such a medicine, let alone at home. The girl sat on her bed staring at the laptop screen, panic mixing with despair from the depths of her being. There was no one to turn to for advice about the situation. After all, Julia was a complete orphan. Her parents, as the girl was told by her caregivers at the orphanage, died in a terrible car accident many years ago. She was barely 3 years old at the time. So Julia ended up in an orphanage where she spent all her childhood and youth. She had almost no friends left. And she was ashamed to talk to those with whom she maintained at least minimal communication about such problems. They would say that Julia Guerrero had gone crazy with her wealth, and they would shut the door in her face. In the end, Julia couldn't think of anything better than to talk to her own husband about the mysterious package of medicine. Perhaps Julia simply didn't know certain things about Ignacio. Perhaps he actually needed help himself, and he was secretly taking these pills so as not to worry his already weakened wife unnecessarily. Nervously biting her lips, the young woman dialed her husband's number, continuing to twirl the empty package in her free hand. She heard long rings, and then Ignacio's annoyed voice. "Yes, Julia, what's happened?" Her husband rudely asked. "Hi, sweetheart. Am I bothering you?" she asked, just in case. She heard some rustling, and then several indistinct sounds that Julia couldn't understand. Then she heard her husband's voice again. "I have a meeting, so speak quickly. What happened to you?" Julia briefly outlined the situation to Ignacio before she heard another barrage of reproaches and insults. "Julia, are you stupid? Have you completely lost your mind from idleness? Why did you even start rummaging through the garbage?" The young wife felt a familiar lump of tears and excuses rising in her throat. Ignacio, meanwhile, continued to attack her. "No, I just want to understand what you're doing there all day by yourself. Don't you want to throw your negative energy into something useful? I don't know, go to a beauty salon, buy some decent clothes, sign up for yoga classes, finally. Why do you keep calling me and burdening me with this kind of nonsense every time? Don't you understand that I have a responsible job? That I earn money so that you can have all of this? Why can't you be at least pleasant in return? Tell me have a good day, I don't know." "Ignacio, I was just cooking. I didn't think it would upset you so much. But it's really strange. What if someone else got into our house while we weren't home? What if someone deliberately left that package to compromise you or me?" Julia squeezed the phone, trying to explain her behavior to her husband. She felt like she was about to drown in her own tears any moment now. Lately, almost every conversation with Ignacio ended with Julia in tears. A sarcastic laugh could be heard on the other end of the line. "Oh, stop it, for God's sake." Ignacio gasped for breath from laughter. "Who could have gotten into our house? We have the security system set up around the whole house. But let's say, even if someone wanted to compromise me, what with? A bunch of some unknown pills? What's the point? And don't even get me started on you, who cares about you? Stop talking to me like that." Julia couldn't take it anymore, shouting the words that had been trying to slip off her tongue for a long time. The laughter on the other end of the phone immediately stopped. "What do you mean?" her husband asked with obvious sarcasm in his voice. "You know what I mean," Julia replied. "As if I'm just an empty space for you." For a moment, it was quiet on her flat smartphone, and then Ignacio spoke more calmly. "Then stop behaving like a crazy hysterical woman. You'd better wishing me to have successful negotiations. Have successful negotiations. Julia wished him in a cold voice and ended the call abruptly. She understood that her husband was clearly hiding something from her, even though his arguments seemed quite logical. Who would climb up to their house during the day or even at night just to drop off them this unfortunate medicine? On the other hand, he had reacted too angrily to her innocent question. And that meant that Julia was still getting closer to unraveling the mystery. After a little thought, Julia made what she believed was the only right decision and, quickly changing into simple jeans and a leather jacket, ran out of the house. Then she got into her small car and, warning the security that she would return in a couple of hours, headed for the nearest town. They lived in a closed cottage settlement for very wealthy residents of the capital. Once in the city, Juliet immediately went to a specialty equipment store and bought a miniature hidden camera. When she returned home, the girl installed it herself in the kitchen right above the table where she and her husband usually had breakfast. Now all she had to do was wait for Ignacio and maybe, finally, she would learn the whole truth. That same evening, Julia met Ignacio in a luxurious, burgundy-colored dress. It beautifully hugged her young slender figure. She styled her thick dark hair like the most fashionable celebrities of recent years. Julia had applied a thin layer of first-class makeup to her face, which the girl had done in advance with the help of a professional makeup artist. The appearance of Guerrero's wife unmistakably hinted at the celebration of the current moment. It should be said that Ignacio was very impressed. Of all things, he never expected such an appearance from his simple wife. For a moment, the man even believed that his mother's advice had finally made some sense. "Wow! You look beautiful," the husband said with undisguised admiration. "And for what occasion are you dressed so elegantly?" Julia just smiled softly at the corner of her mouth. "Well, I'm a good wife." "Yes, I see," the man said with a playful tone, "and I'm very glad that you learned today's lesson. But still, do we have any special occasion today?" Julia was a little hurt by how her husband had taken their conversation earlier that day. However, she pretended not to notice and decided to be clever so that her spouse would relax and behave as naturally as possible. He shouldn't suspect anything. "Oh dear," Julia said, wagging her finger at her husband. "It seems someone forgot that today is our anniversary. It was 3 years ago today that we got married, my dear." "Oh, yes, of course." Ignacio looked flustered, as if he had genuinely forgotten about this momentous date. Julia smiled. "I've prepared a small festive dinner for us. Let's go to the kitchen. I hope you'll appreciate the treats." The couple walked into the spacious kitchen, which was decorated with marble and dark wood. On the wide table was the fish in creamy sauce, risotto, a cheese platter, and fruit. In the middle of the festively set table was a bottle of white wine collection. "It looks absolutely amazing," Ignacio praised his wife. "And what a lovely smell, mmm. I'm sure I haven't tasted anything more delicious in a long time." "I hope so," Julia laughed in response and then added, "We can start with an aperitif if you want to try the wine first. I'll be gone for a moment. I need to check something in the bedroom." With a promising lift of her eyebrows, Julia gracefully and seductively slipped out of the kitchen. After waiting for 15 minutes in a room, besides the shared bedroom, each of the spouses had their own personal room in the huge house where they could attend to their personal matters or just be alone with their thoughts. She returned. Ignacio greeted her with 2 full glasses of a lovely light drink, the delicate and slightly tangy aroma filling the kitchen. "Sorry, I couldn't resist taking a sip while you were away," her husband apologized. "The wine really is magical." "Excellent choice, my dear." Julia noticed that he was holding another almost full glass in his other hand. "Would you like to try?" her husband asked with a friendly tone, handing her a drink. "Of course." The girl smiled in such a way that charming dimples appeared on her cheeks, the same ones her husband once fell in love with so deeply. The anniversary evening went surprisingly well. Ignacio was attentive and caring, constantly praising his wife, and the couple laughed a lot, reminiscing about the past and the happy moments that accompanied their first few months of married life. Later, everyday life and Ignacio's unpleasant character destroyed all the idyll, but at first, everything was simply wonderful. And Julia sometimes felt like she had stepped into a real fairy tale. When dinner was over and Julia wanted to put the dirty dishes into the dishwasher, dizziness suddenly hit her again. Barely managing to grab onto the chair, she felt the floor spinning under her feet like she was on a carousel. "Oh!" she managed to utter, holding her hand to her throbbing head. "What happened? Are you feeling bad again?" Ignacio asked cautiously, holding his wife. "It seems so," the woman answered slowly and tried to force a weak smile. "Sorry, my love, but I'm afraid we'll have to postpone the rest of the evening for a while." To her surprise, her husband behaved in the most reasonable way possible, offering his help. "Of course, Julia, let's take you to your room. I think you'd better lie down and rest. If you want, I can call a doctor." "No need, thank you." His wife hurried to stop him. "I really just want to lie down. I'm sure I'll feel better right away." Ignacio escorted his wife to her personal bedroom, where he helped her change and climb under a soft, fluffy blanket. After that, the husband, incredibly, brewed a fragrant hot tea with mint for his wife. And only after all the manipulations, he went to his own room. Julia lay under a warm blanket and couldn't stop thinking about why her husband was so particularly affectionate and kind to her today. Maybe he suspected something? But no, it's completely impossible. She installed the camera in such a place that it was practically impossible to notice it with the naked eye. Then what was the reason for his strange behavior? At some point, while thinking, Julia caught herself realizing how sad it was that her family had deteriorated to the point where she considered her own husband's tenderness and attention as something abnormal. "It's okay, I need to calm down," the housewife reassured herself. "Tomorrow I'll check the recordings and either finally understand that I'm paranoid, or..." She preferred not to think about the second possible outcome. The next morning, after making sure that Ignacio had left for work, Julia took a hidden camera from the kitchen shelf and quickly connected it to her computer. For the first few minutes, nothing significant happened on the recording. She saw herself and her husband talking, and then she went to another room to show off her culinary skills to her husband. However, what Julia saw later truly frightened and shocked her. As soon as Ignacio was alone, he quickly opened a bottle of wine and poured the light-colored liquid into 2 glasses. He then added medicine to one of the glasses, which he had taken out of his jacket pocket. With practiced movements, Ignacio first added half of Julia's medicine to the wine and the other half to the salad plate. Then he stirred the contents thoroughly with a wooden spoon. "It can't be," whispered Julia as she watched herself appear in the frame a few moments later and accept the fateful glass from her husband's hand. "That's why he was so attentive to me back then," she realized. He intentionally wanted to deflect any suspicions away from himself. Julia rewound the recording a few minutes back to when her husband added the poison to her wine. She paused the footage and carefully examined the poison he added to her food. It was indeed a red and white package, exactly the same as the one she had found in the trash can. Did this mean that her husband had been intentionally poisoning her all this time? Or was he trying to fight her illness by adding some vitamins to her food? However, the woman soon dismissed these naive thoughts. A person who constantly looks for reasons to start an argument would not be so meticulous about your health, Julia thought to herself, and she sighed heavily. The evidence of Ignacio's daily crime against her was too obvious. Nevertheless, she decided not to talk to her husband about it for now. She wanted to figure out why he felt the need to get rid of her in such a monstrous way. At the same time, Julia wanted to test her theory about the poisoning. Throughout the next month, the young woman was very careful about what she ate and drank. Julia cooked for herself, but Ignacio insisted on bringing her food or a cup of tea or coffee himself. "Look, Julia, I brought you this, Ignacio would say, affectionately stroking his wife's head before placing a large glass of juice or a cup of steamy, incredibly tempting cocoa on the coffee table in front of her. Oh, thank you, my love. That's so sweet of you, Julia would reply, smiling sweetly at her husband, then pretending to sip from the cup or taste the food. However, this show only lasted a few seconds. As soon as Ignacio turned away or left the room with a satisfied look, the girl immediately spit out the food and drinks or poured the rest into a large floor-standing flower pot. She had already learned to distinguish between falsehood and the mask that Ignacio had been wearing for the past few weeks. Julia understood what his imaginary concern might be linked to. Miraculously, the symptoms of sickness and dizziness disappeared as soon as she refused everything her poisonous husband tried to feed and drink her. But he must not suspect that she had uncovered his wicked plan. So Julia continued to pretend that she occasionally felt unwell. With each new attack, she gave Ignacio to understand that her health was approaching a critical level. Julia, you're suffering so much, it really worries me, her husband would say, his voice trembling with excitement. Maybe we should call a doctor and take you to the hospital. You know, I'll make sure you get the best hospital room and service. Ignacio's eyes, despite his poorly disguised anxiety, shone with almost real enthusiasm for everything that was happening. Julia pretended to have great difficulty sitting up in bed, playing her role very well. After that, she usually replied to her husband in a very weak, painful voice. Don't worry, Ignacio, it's nothing. Maybe it's just high blood pressure. Could you please open the window? It's very stuffy in here. Julia rubbed her chest, carefully pretending to have obvious heart problems. Meanwhile, Ignacio, like a mountain goat, jumped out of bed and rushed to fulfill his almost dying wife's last request. Of course, my love. He mumbled, his voice breaking with either anxiety or joy. Is this okay? He asked, opening the window almost all the way. Thank you, darling. Ignacio kissed his wife's hands in response and ordered the biggest bouquet of white roses he could find in the flower shops. Every morning, such a bouquet appeared on the table next to her bed. They slept separately at the time, as Juliet constantly complained of insomnia due to her supposed poor health and didn't want to burden her beloved Ignacio with it. Well, he's already preparing for the funeral in advance, sneered Sophia, Julia's friend from the orphanage, to whom she decided to confide everything a couple of days after her last attack. Juliet and Sophia were sitting in a small Chinese restaurant on the other side of the city where no one could disturb them or recognize them. Julia lied to her home security, saying she was going to the city for groceries and that she wanted to get some fresh air while she still could. She went straight to her best friend, with whom she had maintained a warm relationship for many years. Sophia was raised in the same orphanage as Julia, but was a couple of years younger. Sophia worked as a programmer in a private company and had achieved considerable professional success in this field. Upon learning that her friend urgently needed to meet in the middle of the week, she immediately asked for permission to leave the office. They let her go without any problems, as she was highly regarded by the company's management. The girl rushed to the place specified by Julia in her text message. That's where Julia told Sophia the whole truth about her husband's illegal actions, hoping to get some sound advice from the programmer. He's such a harsh man. Sophia shook her head, referring to Ignacio's determination to poison his own wife. Oh, Sophia. Julia sighed heavily, as if you yourself don't remember how old I was then, just over 20 years old. At that age, we're all naive, trust people, and dream of great love. Sophia, having listened to her friend, leaned back in her chair and slowly uttered, Yes, this is a story, a fairy tale come true. It feels like the Guerrero family descended upon you, like angels from heaven, and took in a poor girl. And then they married her off to their rich son. It's like something out of a romance novel, honestly. Julia just shrugged her shoulders. Say it again, romance, the girl replied, teasing her friend. The fact is, my husband's parents never hurt me. Yes, it's just too bad that Sylvester Guerrero has been gone for 3 years now, stroke. And Rosanna has been getting sick more often, but she, of course, holds up and doesn't show any signs that something's wrong with her, but I can see it. However, she still supports me and tells me how to make Ignacio like me. Well, of course. Sophia remarked ironically. Any mother will only seek the best for her child. And your mother-in-law, such a wealthy and important lady, even more so. She probably did everything for her little boy's Ignacio. And she found him the best wife, whom Ignacio, for some reason, decided to kill before her time. Julia felt her hands freeze and tremble at the mention of her recent events. In addition, Sophia unwittingly reminded her of why they had actually met. Okay, Sophia. Julia stopped the flow of her friend's sarcasm towards her husband. Rosanna told me how she suffered with him before we met. Ignacio was drinking, partying, and losing all his money in cards. My mother-in-law said that he only straightened up with me, started to become smarter, and finally began to delve into the company's business. After that, his career went up. Sophia silently finished her coffee with milk and, putting the cup on the table, said, "As you know, Julia, your Ignacio's inner world is still as rotten as ever. And there's nothing you can do about it. Okay, friend, I'll help you. I'll keep an eye on your husband from the sidelines. Let's see what meetings he has during his off hours. Just be careful, Sophia." Her friend asked. Ignacio is a dangerous man, as you can see, who knows what he might come up with. Sophia just waved her hand. Don't worry, he probably doesn't even remember me. How many years has it been since your wedding? Like 3. Considering that we didn't really get to know each other then. Because he forbade you from inviting me to the wedding because of my unofficial appearance. Sophia playfully twirled her hair, dyed in a light pink color. So he basically doesn't even recognize me. But just in case, I'll still wear a hat to avoid drawing any unwanted attention. Plus, it's getting chilly, she said. Julia thanked her friend warmly and apologized. I'm sorry I went along with my husband back then and didn't invite you. I should have insisted on my own and explained that I didn't care about any formalities. But I kept quiet. I was a young coward. Sophia simply smiled, adjusting her oversized designer glasses. Don't worry, Julia. Would I still be friends with you if that ever bothered me? Your husband is a bastard, of course, but it's not your fault here. You're the victim, and until things get really dire, we need to help you out of this as soon as possible. The friends hugged and agreed to meet again at the same spot exactly 1 week later. In the meantime, Sophia promised to gather as much information as possible about Julia's husband and provide it to her. You'll have to decide for yourself what to do next, but if I were you, I'd run away from this guy as fast as I can, Sophia said before disappearing into the bustling city streets. Julia hurried back home, stopping at a grocery store along the way. Neither her husband nor his security guards should suspect anything. She knew that if she made a mistake, they would immediately report everything to Ignacio. And then the consequences of her adventure could be completely unpredictable, and she simply couldn't afford to take such risks. A week later, they met again at the same Chinese restaurant, and Sophia laid out a whole stack of spicy photographs in front of Julia. What's this? Julia asked in surprise. Sophia just clicked her tongue and sarcastically grinned. Well, I thought maybe you wouldn't believe me, so I could at least convince you with these photos that your husband is cheating on you. Julia wasn't offended by Sophia's rudeness. She had always been that way since childhood. The young woman was upset by the photos of Ignacio that she had seen, where he was in the company of a well-endowed beauty with coal-black hair and sky-blue eyes. The woman was constantly kissing Julia's husband and hanging on him while they relaxed with Ignacio in some cafe. Ignacio meets with this, shall we say, lady 3 times a week at the Morrison Cafe, Sophia continued, reporting the results of her surveillance. I've only shown you the most innocent photos. Without details, so to speak, Sophia grimaced, as if it were unpleasant for her even to think about it. From there, they go straight to the hotel. I don't think I need to explain what all of this means. Julia looked at the photos and felt an absolute emptiness inside. She didn't know what to say. Perhaps because somewhere deep down inside, she had long suspected her husband of infidelity. After hiding the photos in her bag, Julia asked, "Are you sure he didn't notice you?" The girl sitting opposite her just smirked wickedly. "Of course, you can be sure. I was very careful and only took photos with my phone," Sophia proudly proclaimed. "I have a special printer at home that prints smartphone photos in high quality." Julia nodded and struggled to get up from the table. Now she knew for sure that her husband had a mistress. Could it be that because of her, he wanted to take Julia's life? What should she do now? How should she proceed? After driving around the city in her small car for a few laps, Julia concluded that the hidden camera footage and the compromising photos were enough evidence to file for divorce from her husband. Julia was not prepared to endure constant infidelity or to live in constant danger of losing her life. That evening, as soon as Ignacio returned home, his wife honestly told him everything she had learned and asked him to officially end their relationship. "Here we go," Julia calmly said, placing a video camera and spreading out the photos that incriminated him on the table. "Either you go to jail for several years for attempting to poison me, or we get divorced because I know perfectly well that you have a mistress. How could you even think of doing this to me, Ignacio?" The spouse, from whom the mask of any love and care flew off in that same moment, was infuriated by the situation that had arisen. He did not want to divide all the capital that he had accumulated with such hard work during the divorce. Well, Ignacio said menacingly. "So it turns out you're not as stupid as I thought. Have you been spying on me?" "Yes, I have," Julia replied calmly. "And wouldn't you have been keeping an eye on someone who, as it turns out, wants you dead?" Instead of answering, Ignacio just laughed maliciously. "That's because you're empty, like a tasteless flatbread. There's no beauty or passion in you. All you know how to do is to create comfort. You're not capable of anything more." Julia frowned. "If you're trying to insult me now, then let me disappoint you. Your words have no effect on me anymore. You've tried to destroy my self-esteem and myself too often. Enough is enough. Either you sign the divorce papers or you'll end up in jail for a long time. I guarantee it." With these words, Julia hid the camera and photos in her purse. Ignacio felt greed and fear battling inside of him. On the one hand, he hoped to seize all the money alone and live happily ever after with Evelina, his mistress. On the other hand, this snake might really file a complaint against him, and going to jail was certainly not part of the businessman's plans. "Fine," he reluctantly said. "I'll sign your documents, but keep in mind that I'll drag you through the courts. You won't get a penny of my money." Julia looked at him with open pity. "For God's sake, Ignacio. I never needed your money anyway. You can take everything, I won't take it. Just let me go for God's sake and let me live a normal life without your constant reproaches and humiliations. And you even thought about poisoning me, you goat." She took her suitcase, which she had prepared in advance. The woman didn't want to stay in this house for even a minute longer and walked towards the exit with a measured pace. Julia had already grabbed the door handle when she heard her husband say something to her. "Well, get out of here, snake. If you want to know, my parents forced me to marry you, and if it weren't for them, I would never have tied my life to someone like you. You're a disgrace, a servant." Julia hesitated for a moment, but then slammed the front door behind her. It didn't matter what this fool might say about her in a fit of anger. Of course, the wife threatened to send him to prison and file for divorce. What a blatant ingratitude on her part. Thinking about it, she just smiled. Oh, how long she had endured all this circus. However, as she sat in the car, Julia began to doubt involuntarily. all the way to Sophia's apartment, where she had allowed Julia to live with her. She couldn't shake off the question of why Ignacio's parents had forced him to marry a simple and poor girl from an orphanage like a church mouse. Julia didn't have a penny behind her. All she had managed to save up in the past few months was a small sum of money that she planned to spend on a rented apartment. Sophia was so generous that she allowed her friend to live with her for free. Julia didn't know what she would do after the divorce, but she knew that she would definitely find a job to no longer be dependent on her bleak past. Sophia welcomed Julia with open arms, and the latter fell into her best friend's tight embrace right away. The whole evening they cried and talked, and for the rest of the night, Julia couldn't get her husband's words out of her head, the obsessive refrain repeating in her mind, "It's because of my mother and father, they forced me to marry you. They made me do it. You understand? I would never have married a rat like you in my life." The next morning, after Sophia left for work, Julia took a small notebook out of her bag and nervously flipped through its pages one by one. Finally, she found the phone number she needed and dialed the coveted digits on her mobile screen. After a few long seconds, a familiar voice on the other end of the line said with a pleasant tone, "Captain Cabrera speaking." "Leo?" Julia asked with a trembling voice. "It's me, Julia Munoz. Do you remember me? We grew up in the same orphanage." For several seconds, there was absolute silence on the phone, and then the same surprised but happy voice asked, "Munoz, Julia, is that you? My goodness, it's been so many years. How are you? Did something happen?" Julia let out a heavy sigh. "It's all generally okay. Leo, I need to talk to you seriously. Can we meet today?" "Of course, tell me where, I'll be there in an hour," assured her childhood friend, his voice becoming instantly focused and serious. Meeting at a local bar an hour later, she explained her request to the man. She wanted to know as much as possible about her real parents. Why they ended up in that accident, how they lived before that. "You see, I don't know anything about them at all," Julia lamented. "And only now I realize how much I've missed in my life. Maybe if I had been more interested in who they were when I was a child, I wouldn't have faced certain difficulties now, let's call it that." Julia evasively described her current situation to the police captain. She didn't tell Leo about her husband or the attempted to poison her. Perhaps she could avoid a divorce in the end. Ignacio was, of course, a terrible person, but would he survive in prison? That was a completely different question. After all, Julia was not so cruel as to condemn her spouse to such suffering, even though she hated him. Being a police officer, Leo could really help Julia, and she wanted to find out the whole truth about her family until the very end. "Okay, I'll help you," agreed Cabrera. "But I have to warn you right away, gathering information takes time. You'll have to wait a while." "I'm ready to wait," she nodded in response. The business part of their conversation was over. Afterward, Julia and Leo chatted a bit, reminiscing about the past, and then each went about their own business. Julia hoped she wouldn't have to wait too long, as Ignacio had already sent all the necessary divorce documents, and she was facing a bureaucratic hassle of several days to renounce her share of property and financial assets. Exactly 3 weeks later, Leo Cabrera called Julia and asked to meet again. But this time, at his office. At first, Julia was taken aback, and it even scared her a bit. But Leo assured her that it was only for her own safety. Once in Captain Cabrera's office, Julia immediately got down to business, asking the police officer to tell her everything he had learned. As Cabrera's story progressed, Julia became increasingly astonished, as it was incredibly hard to believe what she heard. "Well, Julia, you gave me a real riddle," the police officer began. "I never thought I'd have to flash my license so many times in these last few days." The man laughed a short, barking laugh, like a friendly dog. "Somewhere, of course, I had to put pressure on. Some people, you know, didn't want to tell me the whole truth about you, and I'm talking about the people in your mother-in-law's circle." "What? What are you talking about?" She didn't understand. And I'm talking about Rosanna and Silvestre Guerrero not being as white and fluffy as you've always thought they were, Julia. Did you think I wouldn't find out that you're now a Guerrero too? And that you're divorcing their son? By the way, that's the right decision. For a second, Julia was afraid that Leo might have already found out everything about the poisoning. However, his answer astonished her. Guerrero, namely Rosanna and her husband Silvestre, were direct partners of your parents, the police officer explained slowly, making sure that Julia understood every word. And Miranda and Xavier Munoz, your parents, owned a large company producing sports equipment. They were millionaire businessmen, Julia. Captain Cabrera of the police department folded his arms across his chest, watching as the woman sitting in front of him widened her eyes in amazement. He realized that she really had no idea about any of this. The Guerrero family not only helped the Munoz family with selling their products abroad, but also envied the success of the thriving family. The Guerreros themselves were not doing very well. The captain snickered, debts, loans, and a son who was an alcoholic and lost all his money gambling. In short, they had problems up to their ears. And what's the connection between all this? Julia didn't understand. Your father and mother died in a car accident, Leo explained. They accidentally drove into the oncoming lane when they were coming back from the airport. However, there is a suspicion that the brake hose of the car was intentionally cut. The case was complex, and the police couldn't prove the Guerrero family's involvement since there was no direct evidence. Leo gathered his strength and took a deep breath before moving on to the final part that concerned Julia directly. After your parents' death, the Munoz family's companions sent you to an orphanage. What? Julia couldn't believe what she was hearing. Yes. The captain nodded. After that, however, they didn't stop watching you and being interested in how you were doing. Of course, the Guerreros managed to seize all your parents' assets through complex legal maneuvers. However, they understood that as long as you, the direct heir, were alive, their well-being hung by a thread. So, they came up with a very cunning plan. They would marry you to their son, Ignacio, of course, when you reached full adulthood and left the orphanage. She couldn't believe her ears. So, that's why Rosanna was so impressed with the service Silvestre and he provided at the restaurant. That's why she made her stay and wait for Ignacio to arrive. She thought he really liked her, but it turns out they knew her a long time ago. She was ready to cry, realizing that all this time, she had played the role of a money bag for her husband's parents. Believe me, I'm very sorry, but the Guerreros wanted not only their wayward son, but also you to be under their supervision when you were bound in holy matrimony. Their plan was that you wouldn't stick your nose where it didn't belong and never find out the truth about your family. But the money will stay with the Guerreros until you decide to contest the assets and take your birthright share, which is not small, by the way. That is if you're still considering leaving all your inheritance to your husband. Julia was in shock. Upon learning the truth, she thanked Cabrera from the bottom of her heart and then rushed lightning fast to her almost ex-husband's house. Ignacio let her in reluctantly. But when his wife told him about his parents' schemes, the man seemed extremely bewildered to Julia. It seemed that he knew nothing about his family's scheme. Why are you telling me that you didn't know? An angry Julia asked. Wasn't that why you tried to poison me? So you could get all my money? Ignacio poured himself a large glass of whiskey. His wife saw that he was just as stunned as she was. No, it wasn't like that. Ignacio shook his head. I wanted to get rid of you, but Evelina's my new, he stumbled. I mean, my ex-girlfriend came up with everything. Ignacio looked at his wife, his cheeks blushing with shame. We broke up, he explained. But Julia just waved him off, indicating that she wasn't interested. Then the man continued. It was she who advised me to give you that medicine. She said that if we wanted to be together, we needed to clear the way and keep the money. Evelina knew a thing or two about that kind of medicine. She used to work as a nurse in the past. She said back then, let's give her 1 sachet per week, and she'll gradually die. And the best part is that nothing can be proven. The medicine is absorbed quickly and well, leaving no traces in the body. So, I agreed. Julia's face showed nothing but contempt. You are such a scoundrel, Ignacio Guerrero, she said in an icy voice. Now that I know the truth, don't even think about getting all the money. I'm taking my half. On that day, Julia left her now definitely ex-husband's house with a true victory. Having restored justice and taken back a large portion of her assets during the divorce with Ignacio, Julia finally felt true freedom. After thanking Sofia for her support, Julia gave her a brand new, high-tech monoblock as a gift. Julia, who had reverted back to her original surname, Munoz, set out to start a new life. Reflecting on what to do next, she settled on the restaurant business. Cooking had always been a passion of hers, and her experience as a waitress gave her a good understanding of the nuances of the culinary arts. Using her parents' money, she bought a wonderful new home in a distant cottage village away from her ex-husband and slowly began to understand the ins and outs of her new business. After sprucing herself up with a trip to the beauty salon and updating her wardrobe, Munoz entered the doors of her new restaurant not as a former orphan, but as a successful businesswoman. Ironically, she now owned the very restaurant where she had worked as a waitress in her youth. The staff, who had not changed since then, was surprised to see their former colleague as the new owner. They had grown accustomed to seeing her as a homeless orphan and later as a millionaire's wife. They never expected her to become a confident and successful young businesswoman. Julia Munoz, here's your coffee and last month's report, Ramon fussed around Julia, the same manager who used to scold her and never took her seriously. Thank you, Ramon. Julia smiled at him. Don't forget, the restaurant should open at 10 o'clock, no later. Make sure all employees arrive on time or even earlier, or they might miss their quarterly bonus. Overall, Julia quickly adapted to managing the restaurant and treated all her employees well, but sometimes she had to be firm to maintain her directorial authority among her staff. Once Julia went to the cemetery to visit her parents' grave. It was still strange for her to stand and look at the photos of the man and woman whom she never really knew, but who truly loved her. Only now, on the threshold of her 26th year, Julia was finally able to learn the truth about her origins and find her own legitimate place in this world. I miss you so much, the young woman said, laying a lush bouquet of red roses on her parents' grave. Even though I didn't know you, I still hope you remember me, up there in heaven. Suddenly, Julia heard someone softly whistling a familiar tune behind her. Turning around, she saw a little boy of about 7 years old. The scruffy boy calmly walked around the graves without any fear. What are you doing here, kid? Asked Julia. The boy didn't expect to see anyone here so early in the morning. It was only 8 o'clock, and he was almost scared. PFF. You scared me, the boy breathed a sigh of relief. I guess I was lost in thoughts and didn't notice you. What am I doing? Just walking around. It's quiet and peaceful here. Julia frowned slightly. Do your parents allow you to walk around in such a quiet and peaceful place? It's dangerous for kids your age to be here alone, and it's not fun here either. The boy just smiled in response. Don't worry. I've been here many times before, and no ghost has eaten me yet. I live with my stepmother now while my dad works up at North. But Teresa is a real monster. She beats me and even brings strange men home. She spends all the money my dad sends on vodka, so I'd rather stay here. It's better than going home. Did you tell your dad that they're treating you badly in his absence? Juliet asked, concerned. She felt sorry for the boy, and for some reason, it seemed like he was telling the truth about his stepmother. Of course, I did, the boy scratched his head. He had very soft-looking, light-colored hair. But my dad doesn't believe me. He says to listen to Teresa and not argue with her, that's all. The restaurant owner did not dare to leave the child alone in the cemetery, so she took him and sheltered him at her home. There, she gave the boy some hot tea and learned that his name was Vito. She also learned that his father, Ruben, worked as a construction worker in the north and traveled back and forth for work. Vito stayed with Julia for 2 more weeks, and during that time his stepmother did not return for him. Soon after, Vito's father returned from work. Julia, who had found Ruben's profile on a social network, texted him, telling him everything about the situation with his son and Teresa. Ruben did not wait long and arrived at Julia's house by taxi a few hours after returning. "Vito!" he exclaimed, hugging his little boy who had run towards him. "Dad!" Vito shouted back, hugging his father's strong back with his little fists. "Thank you for looking after my little troublemaker," Ruben thanked Julia. "I was such a fool not to believe my son. But when Teresa stopped contacting me when I was away, I started to think. Thank God you found him and took care of him. Otherwise, if something had happened to my son, I would have strangled that bitch with my own hands." "It was the pleasure, really," Julia smiled. "Your son is a good and curious boy." She had given him some books from her library to read and learn. Ruben immediately kicked Teresa out of his house and did not bother to find out what happened. He had seen her looking after Vito in his absence, and that was enough for him. From then on, Ruben became more attentive to Vito and did not trust him with almost strangers. After all, he had only recently gotten to know Teresa, and she had seemed very attractive and modest to him. But it was just a mask that hid her selfish interests, as she had seen in the hard-working, shift-working man a profitable opportunity. Julia really liked Ruben, and she did not hide her sympathy for the young construction worker. He seemed to her to be truly reliable and devoted. And the fact that he loved his son so much only added to his decency and respect in Julia's eyes. Ruben understood that a woman who single-handedly managed such a well-known restaurant and kept her home clean and cozy without any help could be trusted not only with his own heart and future, but also with the future of his son, with whom Julia got along very well. And so, step by step, Ruben and Julia began dating. Their love sparked quickly, but it was a strong and warm feeling based on trust and sincere admiration for each other's inner world. Passion and romance, which were no less dizzying than champagne, came to them a little later. But that made this amazing feeling all sweeter and more precious. 6 months later, the couple had a modest and small wedding, which they celebrated at Julia's restaurant. The woman simply wanted to enjoy her newly found happiness and therefore made the event as intimate as possible. Only the closest people were present at the celebration on the bride's side. Sophia, her best friend who had helped her in the most difficult moment, and Captain Leo Cabrera, a faithful friend and reliable protector. By the way, Leo and Sophia really liked each other. And Julia hopes that already next year, they and Ruben will be celebrating the wedding of her best friends. At the same time, far away, on the outskirts of the city, in a simple 2-room apartment, Julia's ex-husband Ignacio was drinking himself to death. He lived there with his mother, Rosanna, who, without the millions of her former daughter-in-law, quickly regretted the time when she had deceived an orphan. The fact was that after Julia and his mistress left, Ignacio finally went off the deep end and lost what little was left of his own family assets in 6 months. The luxurious Guerrero family home was auctioned off to pay off debts. And his drunken son and mother, who had completely lost their former glamour, had to move to a hovel that looked nothing like their former apartment. Ignacio and Rosanna had practically no money left. After the entire story of the asset manipulations was exposed, Guerrero's business partners flatly refused to work with them, and their business suffered a terrible collapse.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe.